She had everything to live in the comfort of the palace. Fine clothes, expensive perfumes, whispering servants, a life of soft silence and gilded privileges. She could have been the favorite, the delicate one, the one who doesn't get involved, the one who pretends not to see. But somewhere between fear and calling, Esther tore the silk of protection and donned courage. Because there comes a time when even queens must choose between maintaining their position or risking everything for something greater. She wasn't born a heroine, but she chose to become one. She said, looking into the mirror, but it was her soul that trembled. No crown weighs more than silence in the face of injustice. No scepter protects against a destiny that demands surrender. If she entered the king's chamber unbidden, she might die. If she didn't enter, they would all die. It wasn't just about her. It was about a people, a generation, a calling. The moment arrived like a piercing whisper. Either she spoke or all would be forgotten. Esther was queen, yes, but now heaven awaited a heroine. Esther did not ask to be queen. He didn't dream of crowns. He wasn't born in a palace. Her childhood was marked by loss, by exile, by a life where the name God was whispered in a foreign language, in hidden prayers that struggled to survive within a crushed people. She was an orphan, Jewish, foreign, raised by a cousin who became a father and who taught her, even without words, that God's silences are not absence but preparation. Time passed and she grew up, beautiful, discreet, cautious. Beauty opened doors, and with it the risk of losing her identity. She was taken to the harem of a pagan king, a beauty contest, a test of obedience, a long, humid process of oils and perfumes where each woman learned to parade like a promise and to hide any trace of truth. Esther entered this world without resistance, perhaps with fear, perhaps with hope, perhaps with the silent desire to survive, and alone. But there was something about her that wouldn't dissolve into luxury. She was made of memories, of hidden faith, of ancient stories about a God who freed slaves, and of a people who were never forgotten, even in captivity. She was chosen, she became queen, but she didn't forget. Time in the palace could have sedated her. Comfort could have taught her not to get involved. It was easy to remain silent. It was comfortable to smile. But some pains penetrate walls. Some screams echo even when the world is celebrating. A decree left the king's hands, signed, sealed, irrevocable. All Jews would be killed, men, women, children. Soon, in silence, in the name of the empire, and Esther was one of them. That's when Mordecai sent the message. Who knows if it wasn't for this time that you became queen? She read the words, read them again, and something in her awakened. Fear hasn't gone away, but it has lost its throne. Vanity is not dead, but it has lost its mirror. The queen began to give way to the intercessor, and the orphan girl rose up as a woman marked by purpose. She didn't know what God would do, but he decided to do what he could. She fasted. She asked all the people to fast with her, and she said, I will enter the king's presence, even without being summoned. And if I perish, I perished. It was the beginning of the war, invisible, spiritual, deep. Esther did not carry a sword, but it carried a yes. There are paths that appear sacred on the outside, but are barren on the inside. Esther, dressed in purple, seemed to reign, but inside she fasted. Inside she trembled. The golden walls of the palace did not muffle the sound of fear. And perhaps, deep down, she knew. The position she occupies does not protect her, it only exposes her, because the hardest throne to sit on is the one of decision. For 3 days, Esther did not eat, nor drink, nor speak to anyone. These were not days of beauty, nor of celebration. These were days of spiritual gestation. She knew that at the end of her fast, she would have to rise, cross the halls, face the impossible. The king was not God, but she thought he was. His word was law. His face, whim. If he didn't extend the scepter, that she would die there standing, with the truth in her throat and her eyes fixed as if she had already said goodbye. But there is fasting that changes more than the body. There is silence that sows the soul. There are days when we don't hear anything from God. It's His way of preparing our voice. In the dark room, in her tired body, in the belly of fear, something began to shift. The girl who only wanted to survive was now willing to die, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for a people who might never know her face. Love for a God who seemed distant, but who, deep down, was always there, in the silence between one prayer and the next. Esther was being transformed. And the most beautiful thing is that no one saw it. No one sees when God breaks us inside to remake us with purpose. No one applauds fasting. Nobody publishes the vigil, but all heaven bows when one soul chooses to obey in secret. And perhaps this is the greatest gesture of faith, trusting in a God who does not appear, and yet obeying. It was in the silence that Esther understood. The risk was not losing the crown. The risk was to remain silent and lose the purpose. The queen stood up, not as the most beautiful, but as the most surrendered. And when he passed through the doors of the throne, it was not his appearance that opened the way. It was his fasting. It was his cry. It was the invisible. The king extended the scepter, but the true king had already extended something greater. Grace, favor, mission. There are times when all you have is risk, and yet you go, yet you pray. Still you decide it's worth obeying, even without a guarantee of a happy ending. When did you realize that the calling was greater than comfort, that the risk of obedience was the only way to remain whole? If you'd like, share below the moment you stopped running and decided to trust. Maybe someone is silently waiting for your testimony. Not every miracle happens the instant you say yes. Sometimes God waits. Sometimes He acts as one who delays to test what comes after the decision. Esther expected everything to be resolved at the first meeting. She hoped that fasting would open the doors and thwart the enemy's plans. But upon entering the throne room and being received with favor, the king didn't ask about the decree. He didn't read her soul. He didn't guess her pain. He simply smiled, extended his scepter and asked, "What do you wish, my queen?" Esther took a breath. She could have said everything. She could have revealed the plan. She could have exposed the enemy. But no, something in her mind said, "Not yet." And she answered, "I just want the king to come to a banquet tonight." The king accepted. Haman, the traitor, was also invited. That was the first night, a silent dinner, a disguise that tore at the heart. Esther smiled as anguish tightened inside. She served food while knowing a genocide was being orchestrated. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. She swallowed her anxiety with wine. And at the end of the night, when the king asked again, "What do you want?" she replied, "Let the king come to a second banquet, tomorrow." Spiritual discernment is difficult to explain, but there are times when heaven silences us. There is a time to speak, and there is a time to wait another day. Esther felt this. She didn't postpone out of fear. She postponed for guidance, for something greater than herself, for a soundless voice that said, "Wait." That same night, the king couldn't sleep. He ordered the books of the kingdom's history to be brought. He read them. He remembered that Mordecai had saved his life years before, and that he had never been rewarded. At the same time, Haman, poisoned by hatred, ordered the construction of a gallows to kill Mordecai at dawn. The entire sky moved in silence. While Esther was waiting, God was sowing. In the interval between one dinner and another, the invisible plotted the improbable. Esther's patience wasn't passivity, it was active faith, a waiting that listened, a decision that didn't need to be rushed, because God's purpose doesn't rush. He orchestrates it. The next day, everything would fall into place. The king would listen, the traitor would fall, the people would live. But none of this would have been possible if, halfway through, Esther had given in to anxiety. Perhaps you are exactly between two banquets. You've already said yes. You've already taken a risk. You've already given yourself up, but the result has not yet come. The sky seems still and the enemy seems stronger, but trust me, the king's book is being opened. The name that no one remembered, God is remembering. If this part of the script spoke to your expectations, leave a comment below. Write about what you have endured in silence. Someone may recognize your struggle and find the strength not to give up. The second banquet arrived. The table was set. The wine was poured. The king was curious. Haman was smiling, blinded by the arrogance of someone who believes the world belongs to him. Esther sat between them, silent, serene, but something in her had changed. The woman who once trembled now looked death in the eye with a calm that was not her own. It wasn't the courage of one who thinks she's strong. It was the faith of one who has already surrendered. The king drank, he laughed, he toasted, and at just the right moment he asked, "What do you want, Esther? I will give you up to half the kingdom." Silence. She looked at the cup, then at the king, then at Haman, and then he said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, I ask that you spare my life and the lives of my people." The king frowned. "Like this, we were sold to destruction. Someone decreed our death. If we were just slaves, I would keep quiet, but they want to eliminate us." The king stood up, disturbed. "Who did this?" And Esther answered firmly, "This man, Haman, our adversary and enemy." The room froze. Haman turned pale. The king stormed out into the garden. Haman fell at Esther's feet, begging for mercy, but the sentence had already been passed. That night, Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The truth has come out. The deliverance has begun. But notice, Esther didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't threaten. She simply waited for the right moment. She spoke with honor, with truth, with strategy that came from fasting, not anger. There was no scandal. There was direction. The sky works with precision, and what seemed like a delay was synchronicity. Deliverance didn't begin when she spoke. It began when she decided to be silent for a day. It was discernment that moved the miracle. It was the weight that sealed the fate. And the most beautiful thing is that Esther was not exalted by strength, but by surrender. She didn't win because she was queen. She won because before becoming queen, she decided to be an intercessor. How many times do we want to resolve everything in a hurry, by shouting, by exposing ourselves? But God calls us to another kind of authority, one that comes from silence, obedience, and waiting. When was the last time you chose to be silent and saw God speak through you? When did your spiritual posture defeat the enemy before your voice could? Right below what God has already done when you didn't step up. Perhaps your memory is the key to someone's patience. Haman had fallen, but the decree still stood. The death sentence against the Jews remained valid, sealed with the king's ring, and no law of the empire could be revoked. It was as if yesterday's victory wasn't enough to save tomorrow. Esther had defeated man, but she still needed to confront the system. It was then that she did the unthinkable. For the second time, she entered the king's presence unbidden. For the second time, she risked her life. For the second time, the queen became an intercessor. She fell at the king's feet. She wept, she begged, not for herself, but for her people. "How can I bear to see the calamity that will overtake my people?" she said. And there, between power and compassion, something moved. The king, touched by Esther's surrender and remembering Mordecai's faithfulness, sought a solution. He could not annul the decree, but he allowed a new one to be written. A new edict was sealed. The Jewish people would be allowed to defend themselves, to unite, to fight back. And that's what happened. Throughout the empire, Jews grew stronger. They prayed, they fasted, they prepared. And when the day of the massacre came, they were not defeated. They resisted. The threat turned into unity. Anguish turned into resistance. The people who were once condemned now rose up with dignity, all because a woman decided to speak out, all because a woman chose not to remain silent. And it wasn't just about her. It was about the children who would see the sunset. about the parents who would come home, about the elderly who would still have grandchildren. Esther didn't just save her generation, she planted memory, planted courage. He planted faith that spans centuries. And to this day, the Jewish people celebrate this turning point with the festival of Purim, a reminder that even when all seems lost, God raises up someone who is willing, someone who could live in comfort. But he decides to fight. Someone who could be just another crown, but choose to be a voice. And you? How many times has God put you in a position where it was easier to stay quiet, but something inside you wouldn't let you? Have you ever felt like you had to speak up, act, intercede, even when it seemed like it wasn't your responsibility? If this moment has ever happened to you, write in the comments. Someone may be silent today, waiting to read what you dared to live. The streets began to breathe again. Mourning was postponed. The silence of death was replaced by the sound of timid, emotional, almost disbelieving celebrations. The people who would be destroyed remained, not because the decree was annulled, but because God's purpose was greater than the sentence of men. Esther remained in the palace. Mordecai was exalted. He received the ring that had previously belonged to Haman. He became a royal advisor, a voice of justice, a link between royalty and the people. But it wasn't about positions, it was about redemption. God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther. No spectacular miracles occur before our eyes. No voice from heaven, no burning bush, no parting of the sea. And yet, it's impossible to read the story without feeling that God is in every comma, because there are times when the miracle is silent. It's strategic. It is woven between human choices and divine will. Esther didn't see angels, but she was used as one. Mordecai performed no miracles, but he was an instrument of a God who writes political lines and imperial decrees. The people did not win with the sword. He won with discernment, with prayer, with spiritual positioning. The Feast of Purim was instituted, not as a war memorial, but as a reminder of deliverance. 2 days a year when Jews stopped to celebrate the impossible, the day death was postponed, the day when God in silence moved the entire empire to protect those who were his. And it all started with a woman, an orphan, an exile, who decided that his position was no more important than his mission. Sometimes you think you're somewhere by chance, who was promoted, included, listened to, for competence, for beauty, for charisma. But what if it's more than that? What if your position is just the stage God chose for a greater purpose? What if your silence costs more than your fear? When was the last time you understood, it was for this time that I came here? Reflect. Maybe it's not yet time to leave the place where God has placed you. Maybe you are exactly where heaven needs you to be for one more day. After her deliverance, Esther did not leave the palace, but she was never the same again. The woman who once walked among perfumes and silences now carried in her hands the memory of a saved people. She still wore the crown, but it was no longer heavy. It was no longer about beauty, nor prestige, nor royal favors. It was about what she had done with all of it. Esther remained there, not as queen of the empire, but as a living memory that God acts within history. And even though the clothes were made of silk and the meals were made of gold, the voice that now guided her came from another place, from fasting, from surrender, from obedience that did not seek the spotlight, but fruits. Mordecai ruled alongside the king. The Jews were at peace. Fear had been conquered, not by force, but by truth. Esther never wrote a psalm. He never performed a public miracle, never heard the audible voice of God, but God heard hers, and that changed everything. There are people who never touch a pulpit, but open doors in heaven with a bended knee. There are people whose names will never be in the books of fame, but they are inscribed in the history of those who were saved because they decided to intercede. Esther did not save the world, but he saved his people. And for that reason she is remembered to this day, because there are fights that no one sees, but the whole sky records. And when someone chooses to obey even without applause, God transforms their surrender into a legacy. How many times have you doubted the impact of your delivery? How many times have you felt like your prayer didn't make a difference, or that your fasting was ignored? But what if you knew that what you did in secret prevented evil from prospering in someone's life? What if you discover one day that your silent obedience held the thread of hope for a people who didn't even know your name? If you've ever felt this way or experienced something similar, share it in the comments. Maybe today is the day your story becomes someone's deliverance. Esther never received a public prophecy, never saw fire fall from the sky. He never parted a sea with his hands. She lived in a time when God seemed silent, and yet she chose to believe. The beauty of the book of Esther is precisely what is not in it. No direct mention of God's name, no explicit supernatural manifestations, no "thus saith the Lord." And yet everything in the plot screams, "He is here." It is in the silence of fasting, waiting between one invitation and another, in the early morning when the king loses sleep, in the detail of the favor that opens the way, in justice that is fulfilled without a sword, because God also acts without needing to show himself. He reigns in scenarios where he is not mentioned. He governs without needing applause. Esther's story reminds us that heaven works even when everything seems political, random, and all too human. Because the invisible thing of God is more powerful than any visible decree in the world. And what defines Esther's spirituality is not a gift, it's a decision. She decided to take a chance, decided to fast. He decided to keep quiet. He decided to speak. He decided to act. And each decision, no matter how small, added up to a deliverance that spanned generations. Esther teaches us that God's favor does not nullify the process. That purpose does not eliminate risk. And true faith does not wait for signs. It acts with conviction even without guarantee. She didn't ask for revenge, did not demand recognition. He did not become a martyr. She just said, "If I perish, I perish." And the sky responded with life, with deliverance, with legacy. This is the spirituality that needs no stage, but transforms empires. It is faith that walks in silence and overturns sentences. It is the prayer that no one hears, but that makes God move. Esther didn't change history because she was strong. She changed because she was sensitive to the voice that no one else heard. And maybe that's what heaven still expects of us. Ordinary people in unlikely places, willing to obey, even when God seems silent. Today, there are no golden thrones or edicts sealed in clay, but there are still systems that silence. There are still unwritten decrees that dictate who should be listened to and who should be silenced. And there are still people who, like Esther, live between the comfort of anonymity and the risk of obeying an invisible calling. Not every queen wears a crown. Sometimes she wears a lab coat, or a uniform, or high heels, or worn-out slippers. Sometimes she's at the top of the company. Other times she's on the edge of the community. Sometimes she hides in the back of the church, and yet she carries a favor that came from heaven. They are people placed in strategic places, silent but positioned, with access but with fear, with everything to omit, but with something inside that screams, "You are not here by chance." The world teaches you to protect your position. The sky invites you to take risks on purpose. And how many of us have not experienced this conflict? We have influence, but we hesitate. We have recourse, but we postpone it. We have discernment, but we are silent. And if Esther's story is still alive, it's because she speaks to every person who has ever found themselves pressured to choose between pleasing the system or obeying the voice that whispers within. And the truth is that obeying still costs. It costs popularity, it costs security, it costs comfort. But the price of not obeying can be even greater. Silence in the face of injustice. The weight of having been taken a stand and not having taken a stand. Esther is a mirror. for anyone who has ever felt too small, for those who have hidden their faith to keep the peace, for those who have ever thought that it wasn't the time, that it wasn't the place, that it wasn't enough. But God does not make mistakes in timing. He doesn't waste positions, and He is still raising voices that have decided not to be silent, even without an audience. The call today does not come with a trumpet. It comes with situations that require courage, with opportunities that hurt before they make sense, with an invisible people who need someone to speak for them. Mordecai's question continues to echo, what if it was for this time that you got to where you are? The answer still depends on us. She could have lived a beautiful, discreet, irrelevant life. He could have hidden behind palace walls and allowed the world outside to bleed without his voice. She could have been just another beautiful woman that time would forget. But she decided to stand. He decided that silence would be more painful than the risk, that fasting would be more powerful than fear, that the favor she carried wasn't for her, it was for others. And perhaps this is the secret of those God uses. They are not the most prepared, not even the most fearless. They are the ones who, when they hear the whisper of someone else's pain, can no longer sleep in peace. Esther heard this whisper, between perfumes and crowns, between parties and decrees. And when no one expected it, she stood up, not like heroine, but as an intercessor, not to be remembered, but so that others would not be forgotten. Today, she no longer reigns over an empire, but it reigns over the memory of faith. It reigns over hearts that are still afraid, and yet choose to obey, because there is something greater than winning. It is to obey without seeing. It is trusting without a sign. It's acting without an audience. Esther did not see the future, but he built it with silence, tears, and fasting. And every time someone prays in secret, stands in obedience, or gives up their place of comfort to protect the vulnerable, a part of them lives again. Because heaven does not forget those who said yes in the dark. And maybe one day you'll discover that the place where you are now is also a throne, that the pain you carry is also intercession, that God's silence is also an answer, and what you call risk, heaven calls purpose. If I perish, but let it be with all your heart, with faith burning and with heaven knowing that someone chose to obey when everything told them to run away.